Just on that note, I read an article from WHO, World Health Organization, who has now said the leading cause of death by 2050 is likely to be mental health. And that's in relation to us not having these green spaces. There's other studies that show that people recover from hospitals by seeing green spaces. When we become concrete jungles, I don't even want to think about it. But it's just food for thought, of course, but again, everything we all know, preaching to the converted, so anyway. So on that note, Graham Ross, who's going to speak about it?
Yet again. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Georgia. It's really, really wonderful and a privilege to be here tonight. Thank you. Next year will be my 60th year in my industry. You can do the maths. I started working my local nursery when I was 11. It wasn't long before I started communicating and talking to local politicians. It was just sort of that time after the war, and there were a lot of people about trying to help men in particular that had come back who were injured. And then there was this great gardening explosion of lemon trees and barbecues and hills hoists in people's backyards. And that brought a few dramas with fruit fly and a few other little insects, and then the government had to come in and try and help the home gardeners, because the home gardeners were not really controlling gall wasp, but it was affecting all of the orchards on the central coast up at Gosford and all of the orchards out at Dural. And I lived way down the other side of Sydney. I didn't even know where these places were, but I became aware that state and local government could come into your backyard just by putting a little yellow piece of paper in your letterbox. And my dad used to call them the gall wasp police. And once they had that little slip in your letterbox, they'd come in and make sure that you didn't have any gall wasp in your trees. We used to be able to burn them then, which I might add was the only efficient way to get rid of them. So we no longer burn, so we now have a massive problem with gall wasp, because there are no real chemicals to control them, neither organic or anything else. So I got to know that there are these people who would have an impact in your life. One of them was a local a lady who was heavily involved in the school that I ultimately went to, the infant school. And they used to have a Friday night a dance. Isn't it amazing? Everyone learned to dance in my street. Everyone learned to dance in my suburb. Every single person went to that night. It was a great Friday night dance, and old Ma Daly used to run an amazing event. I later discovered her husband was the local parks superintendent for the whole council. Little did I know that I would apply for a job with him many years later. But I got to know that there were these people, individuals who were doing work in the community that had a little bit more responsibility than others. And then, of course, as everyone my age was hugely aware, is that we had a pretty significant Prime Minister at the time, Sir Robert Menzies. So politics started to filter through my life, and I became acutely aware not only were there different parties and different philosophies, but I also became acutely aware that within all of those sectors there were individuals. Some you could trust and some you couldn't. Some you could depend on and others you couldn't depend on. So it was an interesting time through my teenage years when I first met Philip Ruddock. I think I was 17. So I've known Phil virtually all of my adult life. But I got to know lots of others too. I worked in a local government council. It was a great council, because every 3 years it'd go left, right, and I got to know some of the best of the Labor guys you could ever. They were hard-working welders. They had been brickies. They had worked on the wharves. They were real workers. They knew exactly how to earn a pound and how hard it was to earn a pound. I don't see too many of them today in that part. People that have come up through universities and groups and then end up being advisors and as secretaries to ministers and then or even to members of parliament. So many of them have never earned a quid, and I met those hard-working Labor people in the 60s and the 70s, and I had a respect for many of them. And then there were lots of other people before Justin and Marie's party really came on the scene, when we were pretty much apart from the DLP, we were pretty much a two-party country. And there were people I met in the Liberal Party too, the Conservative side of government, who you could trust and some you wouldn't trust your wild dog with. So it was interesting as a youngster growing up. But what I did realise, and it's very likely the thing that's carried me through my career, I am often asked, I think the most common question I've just had a lot of, as you can imagine, a lot of interviews this 24 hours since I flew back from Japan. How have I survived? How is it you can survive in the media today? And next Easter will be my 38th year on 2GB. It's only gardening. But there are enough people in this city, in this state, who keep me there, despite the rest of the waverings and the challenges on Monday to Friday on my station. We've been able to survive. It's now the longest running program on Australian radio with the same announcer on the same station at the same time. And I've now seen 5 owners come and go. I've seen 25 program managers and general managers come and go. I remember on our 30th birthday many years ago, John Singleton rang and he said, I haven't got a bloody clue what you do, make me a F-load of money. And he said, I listened to you on the way to the golf or the horses, and he said, keep doing what you do, and then hung up. That was on air, live on air. A panel operator was so nervous that the owner of the station was ringing up. I hadn't spoken to John before then, I haven't spoken to him since. I hope he's well. He used to live down the road here. Not far, actually. Very close, within short walking distance. His first wife, who drove the big Rolls Royce into their swimming pool into Beecroft, and I thought that was a urban myth. And I was driving along there many years, well, quite a few years ago now, we've been here 32, 33 years, and a taxi driver that was driving me, he said, oh, I used to be a tow truck driver. I said, oh, well, that's right. He's there with his tie, looking very sweet. And I said, really, a tow truck driver? He said, yeah. He said, I pulled Singo's Rolls Royce out of that thing. I said, really, you're the guy? I said, it's true. Oh, yeah, bloody hell, it's true, mate. Roller here, she drove like... Many years later, she turned up on one of our tours in Italy. And she's a beautiful woman, beautiful human being. Not well today, but she's a really lovely... She was number 1, yeah, there's been a dozen or so since, but she's a lovely person. But what I learned then, which has very likely been my saving grace, is that there are parties, excuse me, but there are parties, but there are individuals. And it's individuals that have made this country great. And we have lots of dramas, but we have some fabulous individual people. We've got Georgia and Michael that have created 2 books now that have enabled me to take their story. So I'm just a catalyst for their work, and Michael says photography is a catalyst to tell his story. So we're all working together in this wonderful collegiate sort of way. I have children ring on the radio when I start rambling on, as we will this weekend. At the tree planting National Tree Day this year, we had some wonderful birds there on display. It's the second closest I've got to a powerful owl. The other one was sitting above our head, and I won't repeat because I mentioned the story last year. But
the cat.
yeah, the cat's gone. Famous television cat that Dr. Harry brought into the world and all of its kittens, and the powerful owl took the cat away. I said, Mikey, get down there and at least find me if the body's down there. But it wasn't down there, of course, it was over here. The other family is on the eastern, the western side of Beecroft Road. But it, I put on my Instagram site, and I've only got 2,000 or 3,000 followers, but I put a photograph of this amazing, powerful owl. I'm standing next to it, really, you know, just like this, you know. The response I had from people was staggering. How is it you can get so close to a vicious bird? And I said, I fed it crackers. Children wanted to know how big was its wingspan. And I said, well, I'm about this wide and it's about that wide. So that bird, stuffed as it was, 100 years old? 100 years old, stuffed. It was telling a story in death. And they were fascinated. And so was I. That a 100-year-old stuffed bird can tell a story. And I thought, you know, it never ends. You never give up. Even when you're dead for 100 years, there is still a message that's going out there.
Well, we stuff you, Brad.
But I do know it's individuals. It is individuals. Can I give you and I work really hard as I can at 11 o'clock on a Sunday night for our native plants. But I am a gardener, and when I started the Australian Garden Council, I became acutely aware in the several years that led up to it that horticulture has been looted and plundered by, from my perspective, by the vegetable growers, the fruit growers, the stone fruit, the citrus growers. They've taken over because they couldn't get a foot in Barnaby's door, or any of the previous guys, because anything at 4 feet, you know, had taken over. You know, all the beef and sheep had taken over that entire budget for agriculture. So if you want to do any research, you want to export, import, do whatever you like, breed, whatever, with 4 legs in this country, then you've got to go to the Minister for Agriculture. But they couldn't, all the citrus growers and the grape growers, they couldn't get a foot in the door. So they thought, hold on, there's another mob, the Nursery Association basically, who rolled over. Didn't realise they were rolling over. They rolled over and straight across the gap and over into the Tasman Sea. They've given up because now horticulture nationally and horticulture globally, because horticulture, which to me has always, because I proudly have horticultural qualifications, but globally the same thing happened. It happened right around the world. In fact, it didn't happen in England until England joined the EU. Once England joined the EU had already set out this channel that beef and dairy and sheep and everything else, llamas and whatever else, they had 4 legs. They actually, even kangaroos with 2, were getting into the game, and all the other mob moved into horticulture, and then England adopted the same. And I realised that, as hard as this is for me to say it, it's really gardening. It's gardening that made this nation. We are one of the few countries in the world that knows where our gardening started, in the Royal Botanic Gardens, which has now got a wonderful Aboriginal interpretive centre from the Aurora peoples, which is part of that culture of the development of the garden. The garden wasn't very successful. They were right in the middle of a drought. The soil was crap. But they had read, Governor Phillip had read Cook's manual, because they, on the way from looking at the transit of Venus from Tahiti, they bumped into New Zealand. This is a good place. Then they bumped into Norfolk Island, even better. And Cook said there were rows of palm trees, rows of banana palms, rows of citrus, rows. And of course they'd been there by the Polynesians, had dropped off and planted rows of banana trees and rows of citrus. So they read Cook's journal, and eventually our greatest ship, you know, our Mayflower, was the Sirius. A glorious, wonderful, wonderful boat. Most kids haven't got a clue what the Sirius is. But the Sirius was an amazing boat, saved this nation without any shadow of a doubt. And within a month, it was sent to Norfolk Island. And they collected bananas and citrus, and they came back and they had some food to feed the colony here. Poor starving men and women and children, predominantly convicts, but you know, it wasn't much good for their guardians either. So everyone was having a pretty rotten time of it. Eventually, Philip very smartly put a few of them on a boat on the Sirius and said, go over there and start farming, start gardening. And they did. Within 12 months, they were feeding the colony when we couldn't grow anything in old Sydney town on the shores of Sydney Harbour, Port Jackson. So, yeah, but that was Philip, a really smart cookie. Of course, Cook was a pretty smart cookie too, one of the great navigators. I'm enormously proud that my grandson, not the recent one, but my second grandson, is named Flinders. His real name is Flindersia, which is a great tree. His sister is Melaleuca, another great Aussie tree. So I've got two Aussie trees at Linda's children, and she blames me for starting it. Sandra and I call it Kieran, which is an azalea, so, which is her middle name, so she blames us for starting this plant thing. But he's named after the Flindersia tree, which grows in the desert and grows in the rainforest. How cool is that? You know, a tree that is, you know, pan-continental when it comes to climate. And a marvellous, you know, people know the fruit, they recognise the fruit, but they don't realise this incredibly designed, beautiful designed fruit is actually from the Flindersia tree. So, and of course it was named Flindersia after Matthew Flinders, one of the greatest navigators. You know, can you imagine getting on a tom thumb on a little rowboat with a sail, two Aborigines, we first discovered, two Aborigines, not one, two, and they sail right around Australia. Great journey. Must have been fun in the Great Australian Bight. But they did it. And then he said, Terra Australis, I don't think so. Newfoundland, New Holland, I don't think so. Let's call it Australia. So Australis became Australia. One of the few countries that has a geographical, Australis just means southern. So we're this great southern continent, Australia. So Matthew Flinders ended up appallingly dying just before his entire paper and life was published. Amazing bloke, Flinders. So he's in our backyard, as is the caretaker of our cat, because we have a big, powerful owl that joined us last year, just before Mikey 1 was published, and my son-in-law's grandmother was full-blood Aboriginal. So my granddaughter, my son-in-law, for the first time in his life, became hugely emotional because suddenly his Aboriginal culture came right onto his lap. And like many of his generation and his parents' generation, they pushed it back. Who wants to be a convict? Oh, everyone was now. Who wants to be an Aboriginal? Oh, everyone wants to be now. So suddenly he was confronted with all of his culture and all of his life and his family history, everything, sitting in a tree still there. And he suddenly said to his daughter, "That's your totem, it's come to say good day." And she believes it to this day, and I believe it too. So isn't it wonderful that suddenly somebody who'd been really quiet, and Dan's a very quiet, lovely human being, suddenly his whole history of 40,000 years landed in a tree branch just above our heads. And I think, you know, there's another person who's just suddenly changed, just for a flash, to be something different to what you expect them to be. I want to tell you about somebody else, and it's not a native tree, it's an exotic tree. But it shows you how powerful individual people can be. That's why I love groups, but I love individuals, because in this room, my dear, blessed friend, who's one of the most lovable, committed, dedicated human beings on the planet, happens to live in Beecroft. She's sitting just over there, And it's just wonderful to see you here, pushing hard. Good on you, darling. Lovely to see you. Individual. That's what I love with these individual people who shine. There was a young fellow, Master of Languages, German in particular, at Sydney University, way back in the 30s, decided this place is pretty boring. Lots of sandstone, why don't we plant a tree? So he planted a jacaranda. And the kids pulled it out. Then he planted another one. They pulled that out. Planted another one. They pulled that out. And he said, oh. So he put in a fourth one and put a little guard around it. So those kids eventually, that pulled out those jacarandas time after time after time, they eventually graduated and shot through. Yesterday, I was talking at a presentation, and this woman came up to me and she said, I was one of the children, didn't pull the tree out, I was one of the children that in November, jacaranda flowers, I've got a crash. I got a crash study. It was an indicator the end of the year is nigh. The exams are around the corner. And it became, in that quadrangle in Sydney University, an indicator of life about to change for a whole host of people. They used to sit under the... And she said to me, we just loved if a petal fell into a book. It was like a good omen. I've been to Japan as of yesterday for the 43rd time. I've been going there annually, sometimes twice a year, since 1980. There's a culture that can tell us a bit. Every one of my groups said to me at the airport at Narita before we flew back, Australia's just got so much to learn, hasn't it? I said, yeah. But I said, I don't tell Australians that. I don't tell Australians that. Australia's got to wake up to that itself. I'll tell you about one other lady. I didn't ever promise I wouldn't tell the story, but I'll tell you her story. But very quickly, that man who planted all those trees and became a language expert and a professor of language at Sydney University in German in particular, you know what he ended up travelling the globe doing? A landscaper of universities. He became the Sydney University's landscaper. He landscaped universities right across America, became famous for his landscapes and ended up in Europe. Ended up in Europe, a very interesting time. The only Australian in history who had an audience with Adolf Hitler. And the account was fascinating. Fascinating. Because we all have an impression Hitler was an interesting individual to sit down and have a cup of tea with, let me tell you. Because I sat and spoke to this fellow. He eventually brought camellias to Australia like we've never seen before. Started out with a jacaranda and then introduced camellias to Australia. Professor E.G. Waterhouse, one of our great Australians. I'm going to finish up by saying something that's a little bit radical. I keep searching through all governments, all parties, I don't care what colour you've got, to find people who will support what we really are all about. And at the moment, in the current state government, I found one, Anthony Roberts. And he's just launched a tree campaign. There's a bit of a green shoot that's happening in the Premier's office. It needs to be fertilised and watered because it needs to grow a little bit. But you never know what might happen. But Anthony has, against a lot of opposition, and Reed would know, in his own party, he's pushing through to get at least a 5 million tree planting program underway. And I've been working with him now for 2 years. So you never know. And we now have a mayor who is, the first thing he said to me, he said, we should never have lost those trees in Pennant Hills. Never, ever. So we've suddenly got a mayor, you know, you may not like his politics, but he's actually, if we can work with him, with the trust and everyone else, we might just have something positive for our community. So we've got to look at wherever the green shoots are. Green shoots are everywhere. On the adjust. So we've got to work with everybody if we can find those green shoots. Because without the habitat, which I now have learned, I'm more than happy, so is my granddaughter, to have sacrificed her beautiful Goldie 12-month-old cat to the powerful owl. We've sat down and talked about it. Because she realised that the cat was less important and the owl was more important. And that was an interesting discussion to have with a 10-year-old at the time. She's now 11. Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, but she understands that it's really important. And she gets down to beaker. I can't, I hope there's no parents at the moment. I hate to think what she tells all the rest of them. You should sacrifice your cat. Put it up on the roof. I hate to think. But it is habitat. It is habitat. And that's why Biles Creek Valley is so critical. That's why habitat, food production is so important. And that's why this book is so important. Because it helps people like me and a lot of others in this room and elsewhere in the media and in politics tell that story yet again. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Georgia. It's really, really wonderful and a privilege to be here tonight.
Thank you.